Donc, on va accueillir Nathalie Vucher.
So it's now time to welcome Nathalie Vucher from Europam. And she's going to tell us what Europam is contributing on that topic of contaminants. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm going to tell you more about alkaloids. It's today's great topic. So firstly, I'm going to give you a quick presentation of Europam for those who don't know it. It's the Plant Producers Association, so collectors and producers, that was created in December 1995. These are the different member countries. You can read the list. And there are also observing members. And the ITEPMAI is also a member. I don't think I will spend a long time on PAs. I'm going to Europam has been doing for the past 18 months. About 2 years ago, Europam decided to spend some money for studies on PAs, especially given the regulation that was going to be implemented or to come into force in July 2022. So the point is to have a link with the EU Commission, to have a discussion with them, but we took things even further. So the regulation has been mentioned already. Denis has told you the articles, the limitation of PA content. Emmanuel Boson said that also, because depending on the use of the plant, the limit is different, so it can be an issue. So the point was to strengthen exchanges with the EU, to follow up their position, and we realized as it went that some issues could occur with the implementation of that new regulation. On the one hand, I will tell you more later about that, it was using the prevention principle, a risk analysis that was lacking in many aspects, because the norm was not using risk analysis, but more trade and business issues, as low as reasonable achievable. It was good for some plants, but not for others, because we were lacking data to really implement this principle at the European level. So once we had really had a good notion of the situation, we started seeing what we could do. At the European level, we also exchanged a lot for the past 18 months with other professional institutions, including the Spice European Association. For oregano and cumin, they are faced with a lot of issues regarding PAs, but also with European and local organizations, French organizations as well, I will not list them all, as well as private businesses from the sector. We also talked a lot with ITEPMAI, Denis, and CPAM and PAM, France PAM, for the syndicate aspect. And the point of all these exchanges was really to gather as much information as possible, to have the best overview as possible, both upstream, downstream, but also at the scientific level, to really know how we could bring all this information together and what we could do with it, and also to create synergies and to be a relay bridge between all the stakeholders dealing with AP issues, to come up with a joint consensual strategy, as we mentioned earlier on. So what we can say, talking about consensus, at the professional level, I think there is already a form of consensus. First of all, there is an intrinsic challenge at the production level, and prevention has its limits as well. Denis has already reminded us of this aspect, Emmanuel as well, for Provence aromatic plants. There are many contamination pathways that we haven't modelized perfectly, contamination that can happen even after the plot has been standardized. So there is a limited effect of prevention solutions to reduce contamination levels. Sometimes plots that were strongly contaminated with co-harvesting of PA, things have improved a little. However, in 2021 there was an improvement, and suddenly in 2022 it became a disaster. The SPICE European institutions said that despite all their prevention operations in Turkey, they wouldn't reach more than 30% of compliant batches, and it's a terrible and bad surprise. And more structural measures are necessary, especially for perennials. For instance, if you keep your plots dirty and unattended for 3 years and then you start cultivating again, of course you will harvest the effects of these 3 years of lack of attendance. And it's even more difficult for perennials. So, something that was mentioned in the round table, and I'm using other words to say the same, most of the responsibility is on the producer's shoulders. Because downstream, you can't really do much. You can dilute the batch with other batches to dilute the content. You can sell those lots outside of Europe because the legislation is different. We had a Polish colleague who said that his contaminated batches would be sold in Russia, but now he can't anymore. So the issues are still rising. But in Europe, anyway, the producer carries the weight of this issue. And it's a big issue. So, we've already said it, the development of prevention already happened. There was a big effort upstream, and then we saw alkaloids appear despite best practices. On the Europam website, the new version of best practices for the cultivation and the growing and harvesting of MAPs, PAs were integrated. So great work achieved. But given the external causes, there are less and less herbicides available, and they're less efficient, those available, but it's not really sustainable. Alternative techniques like burning the soil, it's not sustainable. There are also major difficulties upstream for the workforce, because sometimes you see suddenly like you go to your plot, there's nothing, and 4 days later it's covered with rugworts, and you need to find straight away people to weed the rugworts rapidly, and you need to have trained workforce, people who know what it looks like, how to take it, pull it out. If, for example, if the plant you're cultivating looks a bit like the PA producing plant, even if you're well trained, after 2 hours you don't see anything anymore. You can't work on it for more than 2 hours. And climate change is also very interesting. I don't know if Denis says if other studies were carried out. Some PA plants produce more when the temperature rises, and I'll get back to that at the end, because in some cases it would explain maybe why we find more PA after a summer like what we had this year, and it's the case in other countries as well, whether in Europe or outside Europe. Now, in the research world, there is a consensus. There is a difference of PA toxicity. And not all PA have the same toxicity. So, on the one hand, you have legioscarpine and ridulin that are more toxic, and lycopsamine and monocrotaline. I gave you 2 studies references. showing that these two are less toxic, but also parent PA with a free form are more toxic than the N-oxide form, and also relating to the PA in question. So the parent of liazoscarapine is more toxic than the parent licoxamine, but the N-oxide forms keep the same toxicity difference than between their parents.
So there you have them all. This is the predominant form of APs in plants, and they're recognized. There is that general consensus. They're recognized as being less toxic than their parent form. So there are many hypotheses. Research is working on this. They've all been reduced under the format of PAs, but there are hypotheses, but they're entirely reduced or not. So I've given you the references at the same time as in their free form. There was a symposium online by the Society for Research for Medicinal Plants. But I spoke about this as after the symposium with a certain number of people, where the consensus has not actually been published, even if during the symposium it was very clear. There were great many steps had been taken, particularly since the last symposium, and given what was used by SUB in order to publish its opinion, this was and what was the foundation of its opinion. So the question was that using research and the results of research then, as they appear today, with the evaluation of risks, how do we do it? How do we put them together? So the preliminary conclusion that we can give is the following. You have to look at the importance of the link that there is with research, because today, as you know, when you have an analysis carried out of PAs, what do? We have a global comprehensive result for the 28 PAs, and today the EFSA itself, in its 2007 opinion paper, said it very clearly. This is a very conservative approach. And by that mean, this is using this principle of precaution, and the risk is probably less high, slightly lower than what the standards have said or what they might lead you to believe. There is also, and I say this during the last symposium, which I attended, Dr. Schrenk is one of the most respected researchers in PA, said clearly during his presentation, today research has made a great deal of progress since 2017, and we can say today that which is the basis of these standards is extremely conservative. For a researcher, for a German to say this in a symposium, it was very interesting to hear it from his lips. And I'll say what we want to do with him. So what do we do in the meantime? We know that the position is conservative, but how do we act? How do we go forward? How do we translate all of these scientific advances into regulation? And that is where we need the unions, we need syndical help. How can we quantify how we're going to translate the difference of toxicity in PAs in what they call potency factors? That's one of the areas that we could use. We could put a dangerous level, a factor of dangerousness to each one of the PAs depending on the toxicity. In terms of concrete actions taken by Europam, we have effectively deployed prevention because it's hugely important to show that we have, as everyone has said in upstream, that we have put a great deal of preventive measure in using the right tools. We've made sure that producers have these tools to hand. We've also studied, without going into detail, but you'll find it on our site, a sampling method which is more reliable, more trustworthy. Some of you might be familiar with it. That Europam favors this for any kind of suspicious batches. It's a method which is quite complicated to put into practice. Nevertheless, it's complicated at the beginning, but it's also more reliable and allows you to have more certain results, which in turn allows you to have more facility in the reports between the plant producer and the operator downstream who is going to buy his batch. So, Where are we going? What work needs to be put in place? What work is in place towards this corrective factor, toxicity, a revision of maximal limits, and the publication of a scientific consensus? Well, that's where we're going. That's what we're working to. Now, to go more directly to the other areas for exploration in the future, because we believe there's a real necessity to do this. There's really urgency behind this. We're going to have problems later on if we don't with these PAs. But very quickly, you have an example of this, a sampling method about which I spoke, taking into account the fact that the PAs, it's a spot contamination usually. Now, this method, as I said earlier, is reserved to batches with recurring problems of contamination with the natural toxins. So, the higher the number of samples, well, there could be other samples, but the higher the number of samples, given the quantity of the batch, then the better the result. And also we look at the type of the sample depending on the material. And by that I mean, are these seeds, are they large sections? Because then we're going to have to section them, reduce them, so that we're able to limit the uncertainties. We're looking for certainty. We're looking for reliability at each time. So here you have the whole schema, but I think you're going to have the presentation, so I'm going to move on. And then with the European Commission itself, that's where we are now. We were there in April. We had a presentation presenting the following conclusions about our contaminants. We had a certain amount of demands, and we also tried to resume the situation with PAs. So we asked for a transitory period, a transitionary period, to do what? In order to look at to have this period for experimenting, and during that period we would send up reports, statistics regarding contamination and PAs over, say, the course of 5 years. And in the interim period, we would ask the European Commission to align itself, well, when it came to herbal Ds, to limit them to 400 for aromatic plants, to put everything at 1,000. Which is what we heard earlier from many of you. We evoked this as being an adequate number. And then, as a reminder, the food supplements have to be discussed. We're going to reduce their limits to 1,000 as well. Bear in mind, even with a high limit for food supplements, sometimes this signifies that the demand for the plant is going to be weaker, and it's not doable, it's not reachable. On the 8th of June, we reiterated this demand to the contaminants group that we associated with other members of the French world. And what happened the fraud repression said it would be better to have data. So very quickly then, we tried to initiate some data collection. We did that very rapidly. We repeated our demand to the group, saying, this time we are suggesting a monitoring plan. That's what we would propose. And we shared the data that we had collected with them. And we really tried to highlight the fact that, of course, we were using precaution as a major principle. And today, I don't know how we can say, but it was very conservative. And then we looked at the gaps in the risk analysis, and then we looked at the other data that was given by authorities on the level of exposure, the levels of toxicity, etc., could be enriched. And that's an understatement. In his opinion in 2017, and I'm quoting, the SAB said that they had a very prudent approach and wasn't based on probable levels of exposure. They said that the good time group, contaminants in the food chain panel, and that's EFSA that's saying it here, bear that in mind, confirmed the conservative nature of the reference point based on the very strong PAs, such as Ritalin, lazoscarpine, the evaluation of the accumulated risk of PAs in food. And that the risk assessment of PAs on a reference points derived from Ritalin without correcting the individual strengths, the difference in toxicity, etc., is considered as being a fairly prudent approach. What's more, the food exposure to PAs is calculated is going to overestimate the level of exposure for the European public, and that's from 2017. And that's why this is why we repeated our demand. These maximal limits were not easily reachable. We used that to instigate the level of data collected, and you'll see what we did in June. But then also some preliminary conclusions of the study, which was financed by France Agrimer. Denis talked about it just before. So these preventative efforts bore their fruit, especially with regards to heavy contamination. There's a real wakening up to what's happening, a wakening up by all of the sector with regards to safety and safety for the consumer, and the difficulties still existed. So we explained that the two reasons, the most important reasons in order not to respect the maximum limit for the products was the lack or the use or the reduced use of herbicides, and also we had to look at manual weeding. This can't guarantee that we're going to get rid of all the weeds or that all the sources of contamination can be identified. So these are areas that we need to look at. The data that we transmitted to the European Commission then, and in an anonymous fashion, contained self-controls, analysis done in Europam in Europe, but also other organizations who gave us their results. And this was the first real data collection that was done at that level. Now, I'd just like to say, in terms of comparison, the data that the authorities have in order to base their norms or establish their norms to see if it's the standards, to see if it's reachable or not. Out with the problem with oregano in Turkey. Well, they're very weak. The last data that was given from France, that was given to the European Commission, comes from 2018. And it actually dealt with about 30 samples. What we were suggesting was data collection on over 4,000 analytical results, since we've had 8,000. And when I say superior to the data used by Europe, you can see it's well superior in terms of measure. We looked at the data we were able to collect in a very short period of time, and a monitoring plan that showed really the seriousness of the profession and the commitment of the profession to getting this right. We suggested that we continue in this vector, collecting data, using it, but actually collecting data from other sectors and giving it to the high authorities, which allow us to have a monitoring of contamination, but also to see what were the PAs that were involved and that could help research. Very quickly then, you've got 4,100 results in May, 150 plants, 50 countries, and these are the analyses which took place between 2018 and 2022. This is information collected by Europam, including the European Spice Association, and this was sent to CPAM. And this CPAM was applied their data very quickly in order to process the data and to produce something in the limited time given. That's before mid-June, when we had another meeting with the European Commission. Now, the principal lessons to be drawn from this data is that there a higher number that we thought, a number of plants cannot reach the maximal limit, which is included in the regulation. Now, I'll remind you once again, there is a European principle saying it can be as low as reasonably possible, reasonably achievable, excuse me. So you can see with the results, particularly for tarragon, etc., the application of these legal limits is susceptible to bring about a large limitation in terms of production, and perhaps it would even disappear. Now, here you have an example for some plants. This is a graph we were able to put up together fairly quickly in a reduced amount of time. You can see the plants at the bottom. You have the data. So in red, that's what. Obviously, we looked at a level of non-conformity which wasn't really the level we could have used for all the plants. We took 400 micrograms. Why? Because it was easier. We had only 3 weeks to do it. And to see this could be useful in terms of a feasibility project. And even with this, you can see that we've got more than 10% of non-conformities, 5 to 10% for some plants. Well, especially the ones that you can see in front of you. Now, with regards to data collection in the future, what's happening? This is another major challenge for us. We have suggested there will be a data collection which will be more wide-ranging. We communicate greatly with ITEPNAM, with the CEPAM, and they're going to be the linchpins in this operation. It's going to cost more, but we're going to do things differently. We're not going to talk about just having the results from the PAs, but we're also going to ask for certificates showing the results. We're going to have to work on these analytical certificates. The idea being is to see which PAs are involved, at what level, for which plant, for which country. And this is in turn going to allow us to work on the subject using these raw data, the number of the laboratory, perhaps, as you heard earlier, there were certain uncertainties with the labs. We'll be able to identify the ones which are at risk, which are not entirely trustworthy. And perhaps this will bring more new information to the table about what's really going on in the plant world, have data in real time on contamination and the feasibility of having maximal limits as they're imposed upon us today. So practically speaking, how is this going to happen? Well, it's going to be orchestrated by the Europam, but it's also going to include members from the European Spices Association. They've already agreed to this, Food Supplements Europe, and other organizations. They're all going to be involved. They're going to have to send the certificates, which are complete, fully filled in. We can guarantee the anonymity, typing in of data, production of synthesis by CPAM. We're going to get support from ITPMI. Johnny is always available when we call him. When I've called him, he's always available. The Scientific Council and Europam to have the analysis of all the results. I said to you, you have to identify the PAs. You have to bring the data to the table for research. We always are discussing with researchers how we can use these data to give a little more weight to the results of our research. Aid for syndicates or for unions, that's the other wing of what we have to do, if you like. We touched on it earlier, the European Commission. Well, we can show them things that hold their ground, that hold their weight. And this is ongoing with them. However, the European Commission has no reason to move or to shift. If the member states, the representatives from the member states who are present in the working group at that time, or in the plenary sessions of these groups, for example, the contaminant group. Well, if the member states don't actually say, look, we agree to perhaps review how we apply this regulation, and let's not talk about the assessment, we're really talking about the logistics and the implementation. I think we could perhaps go up to 1,000 or what. If they don't show that they're working on the information that they have, that it's serious, that the consumer is protected, well, if the member states don't do this, the European Commission will not budge. We can lie down and we can chain ourselves to the rails and we can show all our enthusiasm, but if they're going to say there isn't this study, there's toxicology reports missing, kinetics is missing, there are gaps. The gaps are huge. However, they will not budge. So syndicate action, union action is essential, and that is why we have a position, and we're trying to refine this position in France with the different organizations here, and then this is going to be translated so as that 4 or 5 or 6 member states with a certain amount of weight, like France, can feed this information back up and say to the European Commission, we want this question to be asked again. There are 2 gaps in your position. It's a very conservative position, and you're working on this principle of precaution that can't last 15 years while the profession dies. We have no more plants. We know that these factors, we have to look at the well-being of the population. Aromatic plants are also for people who are cooking. And when you compare ourselves to countries which only use processed goods, this is one of the factors which well-being and good health, which in France and Italy make us stand apart. So, these exchanges and this transmission of information within the European member states is essential, and Europam has this role of providing an exchange platform. This lobbying, which is shared by all of the sector, where we really do lobby, it's a political lobby, it's a union lobby at country level. I don't know if I like this word lobbying because there's lots of connotation. There are lots of connotations in Brussels, but I think I want to I would like to say more, I'm transmitting information to the European Commission. I want to be involved in exchange with them. I think that's more what we're aiming at. So what's going to happen next? Well, we are still going to work in prevention. We must always highlight that. Protection of the consumer, we can see that in our work, particularly when we do data collection. I insisted on this greatly when I did my presentation. Everybody knows what's happening when there's not any toxicological data. We still know what's happening. We apply the precaution principle, whatever the difficulties facing us. But beside that, we cannot remain in this state eternally. Oregano, okay, this has been put up to 1,000. This is a commercial decision because if not, there won't be any oregano left on the shelves. Well, there won't be any tarragon soon. We have a key production company of French plants, like tarragon, chives, parsley, etc. I'm talking about the basics there. When you go abroad and you can see them, they're dying out. We're going to lose this industry. We're continuing to exchange with research on relative toxicity, see how we can work on the coefficients that we're setting in place for toxicity, and also try and see what the role of the climate in this. I spoke about this with the president of the food supplement group in Food Supplement Europe, and he said this short term could be an option. And by that, I mean, if we have something to say, okay, the plants, alkaloid producing plants, and we know this for any plant, when it's warmer, they defend themselves. Well, you've got all the grains that spread, etc. It's far more virulent. But they're saying, give us some time. We can say, no, this is climate change. Plants are going to change. Their behavior is going to change. When you use climate change, that could be an area that we could use, a vector we can use in order to support our argument. So thank you. That's pretty much what I wanted to say for the PAs. Well, thank you very much, Nathalie.
Très complet. Et on mesure mieux l'action d'Europam maintenant. Je propose de passer les micros dans la salle pour les questions. Léon.
Time for questions.
Sur ma droite.
Léon, to my right. I think the approach of looking at relative toxicity of various alkaloids. Has someone assessed the risk of saying there are other alkaloids that are way more toxic than others? Okay, we'll make a standard that is even more strict for those, and then we haven't won anything. Has that risk been assessed? I don't know who said that earlier on. There is a risk, anyway, because what they've said is that the standards they've set so far, and we can see it in Denis' presentation, it's very high. That's what I've been told. They told me, we've already been kind with you. We decided to set it at 400. If we do nothing, it will be 200 or 100 if we don't work with them. So now we need to act. Anyway. And the discussions I had with the European Commission 3 weeks ago is, with everything you're bringing to us, maybe we could, I forgot to tell that, maybe we could have a modification of the EFSA's recommendation. So it means that if we do ask for it now, but without being strong enough, we'll have to wait for 3 more years, because it takes a while to come back to EFSA's recommendations. So we're trying to gather as much information as possible. I'm in contact with Dr. Schrank, who's the one who carried out the most recent studies on PAs. According to him, can we actually publish a scientific consensus? And with this plus our data collection, can it be inserted in EFSA's data that would be used to change the thresholds? We have several avenues, and this is something that we cannot, do without. We want to make sure that they don't come up with a global threshold for all PAs. I don't know what, Denis, you think about that, but... Regarding analysis, out of the 28 in the methane, half of them, or even two-thirds, are no, N-oxide and oxide are half-half, but nearly two-thirds are cyclical diesters. That's where the least toxics are. And the monoesters are less toxic. So we kind of have an idea which ones are the most toxic. But with the records that are N-oxide and not N-oxide, you know, there are two or three of the vapors class. Yes. But they're thinking of adding more. Well, yes. Maybe one last question.
Voilà. Merci. Mais d'une façon générale, le zèle qui est porté par la recherche.
Generally speaking, of course, it's a public health issue. But what's underlying this topic is what regards all the other products. There are questions to ask. How about nanoparticles, pesticides, heavy metals? Because if I got this analysis right, we said at a T time, the T moment, that it would evolve. So I'm really wondering about the objective. We really need to shed light on all this. I'm a bit worried because, as you already said, it would mean that those that today use neither pesticides or herbicides, any synthetic chemical, would be faced with an even more difficult issue than others. And we can keep using highly toxic products for nature, biodiversity, and so on, without any issue, on the other hand. Thank you. There's one last hand up. Yes, I was actually thinking food supplements, I think we all agree, is related to an image of well-being. And we want the best for everyone. So we cannot allow for a health scandal to happen. We cannot afford that. We would have no excuse if it happened. It would actually kill off the entire sector. A health scandal on food supplements it cannot happen, given what we are doing. And we could see that people are actually paying attention because during the COVID crisis, everyone went back to grandma's recipes to try and find their own solution. And it's about a human reflex to go and look for plants to get better, to survive, to save oneself. So I think we will manage to end up with a health scandal on one of our products because it doesn't exist. The threshold has been set too low. It happened with tea. They had measured too high levels on tea batches for a very well renowned brand, but we created a health scandal. We killed a brand just because of a contamination level that is hypothetical. So I do think that it's important to it's important to make them understand that with such a low threshold, they will create themselves a health scandal that has no scientific basis. So your limitation is not reasonable. You're going to create from scratch something that you cannot control that will lead to a scandal. I think that's one of the arguments that you can use. They need to be aware of that. Because it's about risk management, and they are not doing proper risk management. Thank you very much. I think it's about time to stop the debates and give a round of applause to our speaker.